Hi, and welcome to KV518 Session 3 podcast. This is, as usual, going a week ahead of our next Reflective Practice Saturday, which comes up at the beginning of January. The focus for the podcast this time round is looking at particularly the relationship between policy, research and practice, and is introduced now particularly to help you think about how those issues, policy and research, relate to your practice, and in particular the project that you'll be undertaking for KV518 assessment. Just before we get going any further, a little word about the phrase discourse. Discourse is one of those words that's often used when we're kind of exploring issues of policy and research. And it really means a way of reading between the lines, exploring what's being said either in policy or research, what perhaps are some of the assumptions, and perhaps what are the underlying message. So when I'm talking a bit later on about policy and research, and I refer to discourse, it's really trying to establish what's being said, or and in some cases what's not being said, but what the underlying message of a piece of research or piece of policy is all about. So, on the work-based learning programme, the first and foremost assumption about everyone is that we're practitioners, that our focus is on our practice, on the work we do with children and young people. And the modules that you take are really about exploring your practice and helping you to develop that practice. And when we think about our practice, the work we do directly with children and young people, there are a number of issues that we kind of juggle and we take into account. A lot of the time our starting points, of course, are what we're used to and what our values and beliefs are, and what works for us. And in particular, the way that our colleagues, our mentors, our managers, and possibly even tutors kind of help us explore and inform that. But increasingly, and particularly at level 5 now, and on the degree programme, we'll also be exploring with you much more in what way policy directs our work, and that's one of the focuses I'm going to look at in this podcast, but also the place of research and the way that research informs our work but also informs policy. So for KV518 and the assignment that goes with that module, the idea then is that you undertake a piece of research around an aspect of practice in your workplace. So some aspect of practice which is relevant to your role and relevant to your setting. And if you look at the assessment criteria here, you'll see that there's reference to the way that you are exploring that particular project in relation to researching it. And we're going to ask you to, in looking at that research, to look at examples of practice, perhaps even published research in the area, but also the way that policy is set which might inform that practice. Hence us looking at those issues of policy and research in this podcast. At our next reflective practice session at the beginning of February, we'll be looking in detail about the assessment task and the way that it informs and frames the second of your learning contracts, which will be set around this time. But just to give you a kind of brief heads up, our suggestion is that when you're looking to undertake a project, choose something which you're interested in, which is relevant to you, which challenges you, but also relates to your own passion for your work. Choose something which you're going to be interested in. We'll be asking you to research the issue, to look at the way that theory and policy and practice inform that issue, and for you to think about the implications for you in relation to your own practice and to your setting. And of course, being a reflective practice module, we'll be asking you to observe, reflect and analyse on those issues for you, the children and people you work with, and other adults that you come into contact with. So, policy and research. What do we mean by policy? Who is it that sets policy? What's the purpose of policy? Some people kind of often regard policy as somewhat abstract from actually everyday practice. But we believe on all of the degree programmes here at Brighton Uni that policy is an important aspect of our practice and the way that it informs practice, but also it's kind of our responsibility to what we might call interrogate, in other words, question and explore policy. And similarly with research, as academics, we're very interested in research. Research forms part of the basis of universities' way of working, a way of really exploring and trying to understand what happens in our practice with children and young people. And the relationship between policy and research is really important. I'm going to look in a short time with you at a particular aspect of policy and ask you to consider what's behind that policy and how is that policy related to research. The first then level of policy, just going to touch on very briefly, is local or organisational policy. These are likely to be the policies which are set by your employer. They may be very local or specific to your own setting, or they might be broader in terms of either the parent organisation or the local authority or whoever it is that you work for. And when we're thinking about local policies, we're thinking about in what way, which policies directly influence our practice and how do they influence our practice, who sets that policy and how is it set, and are there implications then for our levels of responsibility and accountability. And of course, in particular with KV518, we're very interested in those issues of professional responsibility, professional accountability, and in what way sometimes policy brings that into question. If you think about what type of policies we often are kind of referring to in terms of local or organisational policies, behaviour policies in our centres may be relevant or open to organisational policy, so the way the behaviour policy is set. Perhaps policy relating to engaging with parents might be another example of local policy, or perhaps inclusion policies may be local policies. So have a think about which policies directly affect your practice, inform your practice in relation to your local or organisational setting. So as well as local or organisational policy, then the other kind of key aspect of policy which we'll need to be mindful of and will directly influence our practice is of course governmental policy. And it's governmental policy that I'm going to touch briefly on in today's podcast in terms of thinking about the relationship between policy and research and this notion of discourse and discourse analysis. So if we're thinking about government policy, we think about in what way is a government's intention set out, and in what way is that intention set out perhaps in terms of legislation or financial or fiscal control. And policy can be represented in a number of different areas or different dimensions. So sometimes governments set out as part of a manifesto ahead of an election what they intend to do if they were elected in government. So they might set out what we call manifesto pledges. If you elect us, we promise we will do this. And of course it's not uncommon when we look back at manifesto pledges that we see that they're not always carried out or they're not always followed. But there are an intention, a statement of intention by political parties in saying, if you vote for us, this is what we stand for, this is what we intend to do, this is how we will address some of the issues which we feel need addressing in society. So manifesto pledge will be one area where we might see an indication of policy. Another one might be the vision statements that governments make. Not only as part of manifesto pledges, but once a government is elected. And usually the very first time that a new Prime Minister appears on the steps of 10 Downing Street, that's the time when we see vision statements articulated. And it's the first opportunity a new Prime Minister has to say, this is what I stand for. Recently we've seen, of course, Theresa May make some of her vision statements when she assumed office, and I'll come back to Theresa May's policy in a second. So vision statements, and also at party conferences are the other places that we often see vision statements pronounced. Green papers and white papers. Just a brief word there, particularly as I'm going to look at particular in detail at a specific green paper. Green papers are statements of intent by governments, which are usually then consulted on. So they're not law. They're a statement by government which says, we're thinking of doing this, what do you think? And green papers are then usually followed by a white paper, where a white paper is a firmer statement of this is what we're going to do. So green papers usually precede white papers. Looking back over recent times, green papers, we've had green papers around special educational needs, and of course famously under the Labour government, perhaps one of the most influential green papers was Every Child Matters. So green papers themselves aren't legislation, they're not acts of parliament, but they often pave the way for white papers and so on. White papers often then say we're going to, not only this is what we're going to do, but we're going to enshrine that policy in an act of parliament, and a bill is something that then goes through parliament before becoming an act. An act of parliament is law. A bill is what proceeds through Parliament, through the House of Commons and the House of Lords, before being approved by government and Parliament to become an act. And the other aspect of policy that we also need to keep an eye on, particularly in more recent years, is fiscal control. By fiscal control, I mean the way that budgets are set, which then obviously direct practice and direct policy. So the overarching fiscal control under the banner of austerity in recent times has been a way of setting policy, if you like. In other words, we're going to restrict the amount of funding in public services, therefore that directs the extent to which we are controlling and what type of measures we are controlling education, health, social care and other public services. So those range of issues, manifesto pledges, vision statements, green papers, white papers, bills and acts of parliament, and then fiscal control are a number of the ways that we see government policy being enacted. And so when we're trying to understand what policy looks like, very few of us will sit down and read the whole of an act of parliament or the whole of a green paper, not unless we're really interested or we're really exploring that area in detail. But what we would do ordinarily is look to see to what extent a green paper or a policy has what we call an executive summary. If you like, this is usually the first couple of pages of a new policy, and it summarises what the key points are, often in bullet point forms. And for most of us, the way we start to engage with policy is to read what the executive summary says. Of course, the executive summary is written by the people who wrote the policy, so in balance to that, we often look to then see what commentaries we might find. And in thinking about what commentaries we consider, then we have to then think about, so who's writing that commentary, what's their angle, what's their take on the summary, in what way are they regarded as neutral, in what way are they regarded as reputable, and in what way are they can they be relied upon to bring a critical eye to that policy. And we would often query, for example, the way that popular press provides an in-depth or analytical commentary. Remember that most of the newspapers and the political and the public press that we read are owned by large organisations who often are in hand with government in setting or agreeing policy. So we have to think very carefully about whose commentary we're reading and what degree of reputable reliability that source has. And in doing so, what we're looking to do is develop an understanding of the discourse of that policy. We're looking to read between the lines to see what the assumptions are, to see to what extent that policy is a robust analysis of the issue it's trying to address, and then the solution it's offering in response to that analysis. So we're really trying to critique what the government is saying about an issue in order to then direct the practice that you and I undertake in our work. Okay, so a bit of history, and we don't need too long a memory to recall this, but actually it is quite interesting how already it feels like it's been around for a while. On the 22nd of November, we had a Conservative government which was led by David Cameron. And that government had only been elected the previous year. And one of the manifesto pledges of the Cameron government was that he would lead the country into a referendum in terms of its membership of the EU. That referendum took place on the 23rd of June, and perhaps surprisingly to a number of people, as a country, the majority of people that voted in that referendum voted to leave the EU. And so we were faced with, perhaps even for the government, a perhaps unexpected outcome. And fairly quickly after that Brexit vote, as it became known, Cameron resigned. And 6 weeks later, on the 13th of July, Theresa May became Prime Minister. Previously, she'd been Home Secretary. So she was elected by the Conservative Party, not by you and I, not by the British populace, but by the Conservative Party. There was no election to make her, no national election to make her Prime Minister, and so there were none of the usual manifesto pledges for a new government. And in fact, the first indication we had of Theresa May's government was on the steps of Downing Street when she assumed office. And in a sense, that was, if you like, the first of her vision statements. And then the words that I've included here on this slide are taken from her speech to the Conservative Party conference on the 1st of October. And this was the first time she was able to fairly articulately, if you like, set out what she felt the direction of the Conservative Party and the Conservative government was going to take. The only mandate it had been given, of course, was to leave the EU, was the Brexit vote. But very quickly, as is the case of most new prime ministers, she had reorganised her cabinet. Most of the new ministers, many ministers were new in post, and interestingly, one of the first pieces of policy that she addressed as prime minister actually wasn't Brexit, and it wasn't a kind of a foreign policy or anything like that. It actually was an education policy. The previous Academies Bill, which was at that stage was going through Parliament, was scrapped. And instead, she spoke quite strongly about wanting to revisit grammar schools and return to selective education. And so one of the first policies that the government presented in the form of a green paper was an education policy. So the new education green paper, Schools That Work for Everyone, was launched on the 12th of September. And there was a 3-month review process whereby all responses to that green paper had to be in by the 12th of December. And as I'm making this podcast now, we are waiting the outcome of the consultation process. It's probably going to come sometime in the new year, where the government will say in what aspects is it going forward then in terms of the consultation process. It's interesting how much time is given for consultation processes. Often if it's a policy the government's going to push through regardless of what people think, it will be a very short period of consultation. This case, a 3-month period, was okay, and it was convenient that it was sort of in a sense by Christmas. But in a sense, given that this was one of the first policies that May was putting forward, it's very clearly setting forward an intent. And I'll go through a bit more detail this policy when we come together for the next session on the Reflective Practice Saturdays. But the main thrust of the policy is an expansion of selective education, so grammar schools whereby we introduce some method of selecting who goes to schools usually on a performance-based assessment process. The Green Paper also referred to the independent status of independent schools and how independent schools were maintaining their charitable status. For universities, it linked sponsorship of free schools and academies to raising fees. So in other words, for universities to raise fees, they would be required to sponsor or open free schools and academies, and it also looked at particularly the reach of faith schools. But one of the things I'm going to ask you to do is reflect on and perhaps read a bit about those this Green Paper ahead of the next session, so we can kind of discuss this together. So the Green Paper, the process of consultation is now closed, but I've given you a copy of the Green Paper on the Student Central website for this module. So, what's going on in Theresa May's head? Why would she consider a return to grammar schools and selective education to be in the interests of the country? What is it about selective education that appeals to her? And perhaps, particularly as we are, we're part of a university, we would expect, perhaps what we call an interrogation of that policy, an understanding, an exploration of that policy, and the way that policy does or doesn't reflect research. So what advantages does Theresa May and her government see that selective education is beneficial? What are the values underpinning that decision? And what research is useful that she may have drawn upon when setting policy? I think whenever we're looking at policy by the government, it's always important to say, on what basis is this policy reflecting rigorous research that's been undertaken into the area? But by the best will in the world, politicians are not experts in their particular field that they are acting on behalf of as government ministers. It's very rare that a government minister, for instance, in education, would be necessarily an education expert. Occasionally it happens, but not very often. So we would expect that politicians to be advised by perhaps people that are more informed, and certainly to draw on research that perhaps might give us a rigorous analysis of a particular issue. So one of the things we want to look at is, in what way is the government's Green Paper, particularly aspects of selective education, in what way does that reflect current research and current critical thinking? And that process of looking at policy and thinking about what's behind policy and thinking about research that's been undertaken into a particular area of practice, that process of looking at discourse, as we've said, about really examining what informs practice, the way that policy informs practice, the way that theory and research inform policy and practice, those processes are the same processes that we want you to undertake for KV518 in your assessment task. In choosing an aspect of practice to focus on, we want you to look at what policies may direct that practice, whether they be local or national policies, what theory underpins that practice, what evidence there is perhaps from other settings of good practice in that area, and in what way does research inform policy and practice. And those are the issues we're going to be supporting you on in relation to your assessment task for this module. So I hope this has been interesting and useful for you. We are meeting together again on the 7th of January, and I'll be sending out some details about that session, including rooms and so on, and timings. Have a look on Student Central, and I look forward to seeing you in a week's time.